The forest before memory. Morning mist rises slowly above a vast canopy of green. Not the thin green of scattered trees, but a deep, breathing forest. Layer upon layer of life. Before maps, before borders, before the name Benin ever reached foreign tongues, there was Igodomigodo. The land that would one day be called Edo State was once a vast tropical rainforest, humid, fertile, red with iron-rich earth. The soil stained the feet of those who walked it. Rivers threaded quietly through the landscape. The Ikpoba, the Ovia, smaller tributaries feeding larger currents that eventually met the Niger. Birds broke the silence at dawn. Drums answered at dusk. The forest was not empty. It was not primitive. It was not waiting to be discovered. It was organized. Civilization does not begin when someone writes about it. It begins when people assign meaning to space, when they decide who leads, when they define what is sacred. Long before European ink touched parchment, people here had already formed structures of authority, belief, and continuity. The question, then, is not when civilization arrived. The question is, who were the people before the Obas dynasty? Oral tradition speaks first of the Ogiso, the sky kings. Ogiso, literally, Ogiso, king from the sky. The title suggests not just authority, but divine sanction. These were rulers believed to be chosen, elevated, cosmically aligned. The Ogiso dynasty is remembered as ruling roughly between the 9th and 12th centuries, approximately 900 to 1100 AD, though oral chronology bends differently than written time. What matters is not the exact year. What matters is that by the early 2nd millennium, this forest was governed by centralized leadership. There was a capital. There were courtyards. There were rituals binding ruler and ruled. The Ogiso did not govern alone. Around him stood councils of elders, men who represented lineages, guilds, spiritual authorities. Leadership was not chaos. It was layered. Sacred and political power were inseparable. To rule was to mediate between earth and sky. To judge was to preserve cosmic balance. Oral historians, the keepers of memory, became the archives of the kingdom. Stories were not entertainment. They were governance. They were law. They were continuity. The forest remembers in stories. And beneath the red earth of Igodomigodo, something ancient still stirs. The light shifts. Bronze warmth touches reconstructed courtyards. Mud walls, polished smooth. Open-air compounds arranged with intention. Central spaces for gathering. Spaces for ritual. By around 900 AD, Igodomigodo was not a loose settlement of huts. It was structured. The Ogiso presided over a stratified society. Lineages held roles. Craft specialists emerged. Ritual experts maintained cosmological order. Political authority radiated outward from the center. The palace was not simply a residence. It was a cosmological axis. The rulers stood at the intersection of visible and invisible worlds. Urban planning developed organically but deliberately. Compounds formed clusters. Defensive measures began to appear, not yet the vast walls of later centuries, but early earthworks and boundary markers. Trade networks extended across West Africa. Goods moved through forest paths, kola nuts, ivory, pepper, textiles. Rivers became arteries of exchange. Igodomigodo was not isolated. It was connected to Yoruba territories to the west, to Igbo lands to the east, to wider forest economies. The Ogiso dynasty maintained legitimacy through ritual performance. Festivals reaffirmed authority. Ancestral veneration anchored identity. But power is fragile when trust erodes. Over time, oral traditions speak of instability. Certain Ogiso rulers are remembered as just. Others are remembered differently. Internal disputes grew. Court factions hardened. The sacred trust between ruler and people began to weaken. In some accounts, the final Ogiso, often identified as Owodo, struggled to maintain unity. His son, Prince Ekaladeran, became central to unfolding events. The palace, once a center of cosmic harmony, became a site of tension. Whispers replaced songs. Elders debated the future. The forest listened. A kingdom that had known centuries of sacred kingship now faced uncertainty. The Sky Kings were no longer untouchable, and Igodomigodo stood at the edge of transformation. Destiny rarely arrives with noise. Sometimes it comes through exile. Oral tradition recounts that Prince Ekaladeran, also known as Izadowa, son of the last Ogiso, was banished under palace intrigue. He journeyed westward, into the Yoruba heartland of Ile-Ife. Ife, a city already sacred in its own cosmology, a place associated with origin myths and divine kingship. There, the exiled Prince Ekaladeran is said to have risen to prominence. In some traditions, he became known as Odujuwa, though interpretations vary and historians debate the overlap between legend and genealogy. What remains consistent is the interconnection. Igodomigodo and Ife were not strangers. They were part of a network of West African polities that engaged in diplomacy, marriage alliances, and exchange long before European ships appeared on Atlantic horizons. When unrest deepened in Igodomigodo, elders sought resolution. Not conquest, not annihilation, but restoration. They looked outward, toward Ife. From that connection emerged Oranmiyan, son of Odujuwa, associated with Ife's royal lineage. He arrived in Igodomigodo not as a colonizer, but as an invited mediator, though the political complexity of the moment cannot be reduced to simplicity. Oranmiyan's rule was brief. Oral accounts suggest he found the land difficult, perhaps politically, perhaps culturally. Before departing, however, he left behind a son. Yuka, I would become the first Oba. And with him, the system changed. The ruler was no longer Ogiso, king of the sky. He became Oba, a title that carried both earthly governance and sacred authority, but reorganized, restructured. The throne was reborn. Institutional reforms followed. Palace structures were formalized. The hierarchy of titled chiefs, the Uzama and other aristocratic lineages, crystallized. Coral beads became visible symbols of authority, red like the earth itself. Regalia encoded power. Ritual became codified. The DNA of what the world would later call the Benin Kingdom took shape in this moment of transition. This was not a rupture. It was evolution. Igodomigodo did not disappear. It transformed. The forest expands again, but now it is carved, layered into earthworks so vast they once puzzled outsiders. Over centuries, not in a single generation, the people of this kingdom constructed an immense system of moats and walls. The Benin earthworks, stretching an estimated 16,000 kilometers when including regional networks, one of the largest earthwork systems in human history. Ditches dug deep into red soil, banks raised high, defensive sophistication embedded into landscape. This was not accidental labor. It required organization, coordination, authority, communal effort on a monumental scale. The walls were defense, yes, but they were also statement. They marked territory. They defined sacred and civic space. They signaled permanence. While other regions of the world navigated their own medieval conflicts, this forest civilization shaped Earth into architecture of endurance. Not to compete, not to compare, but to live securely. Urban planning intensified, streets aligned, palace expansions multiplied, guild systems strengthened, bronze casters, ivory carvers, leather workers, each contributing to a growing aesthetic language. Civilization is intention made visible, and the walls of Benin were intentionally written into the earth. They remain, even in fragments, as memories shaped by human hands. Names carry power. Igodomigodo was its beginning. But over time, transformation reshaped identity. The word Benin would later emerge through Portuguese contact in the late 15th century, derived from interpretations of local terms such as Ubini. But that future was still distant. For now, the Obas system solidified authority. Lineages stabilized. The capital flourished. Ritual calendar marked time. Artisans refined skill that would one day astonish the world in bronze and brass. The forest kingdom had taken on a new form. Igodomigodo had become something else, not erased, but renamed. And one day, ships would arrive. And one day, fire would burn. And one day, looting would scatter sacred art across continents. But that is not this moment. Before bronze plaques carried royal faces across oceans. Before colonial soldiers breached walls. Before global museums debated ownership. There was a forest. There were sky kings. There was exile and return. There were walls raised from red earth. There was Igodomigodo. Empires do not rise from emptiness. They rise from memory. Kindly like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to this YouTube channel.